Welcome to a very special edition of Rebellion's educational series. I have a compliance legend with us today, Eric T. Young. Oh, without a doubt. This man was a chief compliance officer at JPMorgan, CIBC, deputy chief at UBS Investment Bank, global chief S&P ratings, RBS Bank Scotland. There are few people who have had the vantage point. He was also a manager and a compliance lead at GE and a Federal Reserve supervisory analyst. So we're talking about really one of the most educated individuals on the planet when it comes to compliance. Well, it's a big job right now, and I'm excited to see this book you have coming out, Eric, Declaration of Independence. Tell us about that.
Well, it's something that I've wanted to do for a long time. I've been a career compliance officer or regulator for 40 years. I like round numbers. I love math. So I graduated at 20 at Columbia, worked for 40 years, 5 years at the French bank BNP. So at the age
I
of
forgot,
60,
yes, you were also chief compliance officer at BNP Paribas, a behemoth. This only goes to show how absurd your resume is and how accomplished you are as an individual. I've sat down with Nobel laureates, and I'll tell you there are a few people who've had such a thick resume as you are.
Thank you. What I'm most proud about is enabling change, ultimately for the better. But I've seen the good, bad, and the ugly throughout my careers as well. But
can we start with GE? Is that okay? Because I mean, GE
Sure.
is one example where, kind of everything that could go wrong seemed to go wrong.
So I joined 2006 through 2011. It was still, had the buzz of Jack Welch, the legacy, and people made great careers, a lot of money from the stock price, but it was also a complex machine. And that's how I view organizations, complex machines, which are also like complex human bodies. The body is a combination of many moving parts, and GE epitomized it, but it was also the bellwether of the economy. It was the company to work for, if you will. And from
Yes.
an ethics and leadership point of view, it was viewed as one of the ethically purest in the world in the eyes of many. So it was
GE was the creme de la creme of corporate America, without
exactly.
a doubt. And so what went wrong with Jeffrey Immelt? How did he manage to make so many mistakes with one company?
Well, the question is, are companies too big to manage? That's one question, because they had at that time NBC Universal, light bulbs, jet engines, nuclear reactors, water, you name it, they did it. They made it all over the world. So the question is, how do you ultimately drive a consistent culture across an organization like GE? I think they did a good job, but the challenge and the difference between banks and non-banks, which we'll talk about later, is non-banks are really good at putting together programs that are corporate-wide and say the right things with respect to ethics.
Eric, you talked about an accountability pyramid. Do you find those more in finance or in non-finance currently?
I think it's across the board. Accountability is basically about human nature. It's behavior at the end of the day. And, Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. My book, in many ways, is about culture meets strategy over breakfast, because they need to go hand in hand.
I love that.
And
by the way, I've been following Eric on LinkedIn for maybe 6-7 years, and he's one of the more insightful and kind individuals that I've found on LinkedIn. Many successful people, are rather insensitive, but I really appreciate your sensitivity to the humankind. So.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. I don't know if all my staff believe I'm as humane as I like to be, because part of what I had to do was re-engineer, but we always try to find humane ways ultimately at the end of the day in terms of restructuring or otherwise. But compliance is about human behavior, culture and strategy. I learned at the Fed really go hand in hand. And as an analyst at the Fed, I looked at strategy to recommend whether a bank, whether foreign or domestic, could get approval from the Fed, not only in terms of their financials, but also their management, their culture, their record of compliance. And they didn't call it compliance at that time, but it boils down to one word: culture. And
Eric,
it's no different.
I'm
Yes,
sure you remember the MF Global saga from 15 years ago. That
sure.
was an interesting case because the chief compliance and risk officer actually resigned over what John Corzine was doing with the firm. Would you recommend that as the best course if you're the chief compliance officer and you come across a situation where you have a board letting a CEO run rampant?
Yes, in short, I teach at Fordham Law, corporate
I
compliance, and
apologize. Yes, you are an adjunct professor at Fordham Law. Very impressive. I apologize for forgetting that as
thank
well.
you. No need to apologize. I love to teach. I love to give back and learn from the students as well. But one of the classes talks about whether to resign or not, because it's a moral dilemma. It's a financial decision, but ultimately, it's about doing the right thing. And regulators, unfortunately, through enforcement actions, have plenty of examples where they say the compliance officer should have resigned. They knew what was going on, and the longer they don't, it becomes aiding and abetting, at least in the regulator's eyes.
I know without a doubt. So let's talk data integrity and AI. How can we leverage predictive business analytics into predictive risk analytics, particularly over human behavior?
So on the business side, firms have been incredibly innovative. Artificial intelligence is another way of saying just fast, smart computing. And I'm a big chess fan, and I used to be a chess player in my day. And when Big Blue and Kasparov played each other, it was, to me, just as big news as Bobby Fischer and Spassky playing a couple decades earlier. It's because it's about machine versus man, and there's a lot of science fiction around it, but ultimately the businesses, to stay competitive, have to be innovative, particularly in times of crisis. So the question then is, how do the control functions, including the board, if you think about it, they are a control function, keep up? And so it's a matter of leveraging the business tools, the business analytics for risk analytics so that it can be predictive. And ultimately it should be end-to-end anyway, coming from the business source system, feeding into a lake, and then it's just a matter of extracting the right data.
The way Wimbledon has a computer system to kind of provide oversight to the umpires and referees, you believe in time there should be computer systems for all corporations to provide oversight on movements and functions to make sure that a part of the business isn't moving in a risky direction? Is that what we're getting at?
Well, I'm a huge tennis fan and a huge baseball fan. You have followed
myself as well.
It takes the fun out of the game if you take out all of the human aspects of the game. So
we're working on getting Yvonne Lendl on the show, by the way, to discuss how tennis is innovated. He's a family friend and he's a little shy and reticent, but he's one of my heroes, and I'm hopeful we'll get him.
I would love to be on. I don't know about the court with him, but I'd love to be on a panel with him.
Very cool guy. Very loving father too, by the way. Great family man.
And one of the first nutritional athletes, if you will.
No, good point. Indeed, Eric.
And so, yes, machines are important, but at the end of the day, it still boils down to human judgment. And you've probably seen me and read from me about that ultimately it's about judgment, and it goes back to human behavior. The question is, how can we leverage machines to help human behavior anticipate risks? And that's why it's like a chess game. You got to see the big board, you got to understand the pawns and the rooks and the bishops 10 moves ahead at least, and anticipate your opponent, which is the risk. And I've said before, the difference is it's a win-win game. Everyone wins in the chess game of culture and
of course, a compliance officer does not want to be in a position where he has to kind of be, the umpire saying, hey, you're doing, right. Whereas it's easier if it's kind of, a built-in inlay, like, hey, just FYI, a situation, so much of, human interaction is if you can deal with them in a positive way, you create a happy employee versus an angry employee. And then once you've done a little bit of negativity with an employee, I found at least, it's hard to come back from that road when they start.
Exactly. And baseball is a great analogy because you can have all the metrics in the world, but unless it's distilled for the batter or the pitcher as to what are the key weak spots, what are the key strengths. The board is no different. They should see all those metrics, but in a condensed, crystallized storytelling way that the chief compliance officer directly can tell.
Yeah. It's amazing how, Mickey Mantle said, it's amazing how little we know about the game we've been playing all of our lives. And so I can see, baseball and chess, like tennis, have a lot of geometry to them. And
Yes.
probably baseball more than anything, because there's so much data inlaid in baseball. The idea that on-base percentage was just overlooked for 100 years is really just mind-boggling. I mean, really.
Absolutely. And geometry and math is not necessarily one of my strengths, but one of my passions. So you referenced before the accountability pyramid, which is at the end of the day, the board at the top and compliance at the bottom. Both are personally liable, particularly relative to management, but they're also hostage to management's conduct, their behavior. And when something goes wrong, oftentimes it's the board getting sued and the compliance officer getting sanctioned. And what happens to C-suite and the business manager that did something or didn't do something, they get off the hook way too often. And so I have a number of recommendations, which I won't go into detail, which are going to be in my book. There's a lot of geometric references in there around a compliance hexagon of 6 recommendations, all fitting into an information security matrix that Homeland Security has put together, not only for COVID, but for national security. And what it fits into, and we'll talk about this, is how finance feeds into that.
Your 6 points for compliance are fantastic. They're enlighten the board, Plato's allegory of the cave, hold management accountable, declare compliance independence, invest in compliance resources, including AI and GRC tools, and disinfect firm opacity.
Yes. My bad.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and shield and protect whistleblowers.
Yes.
So, these are very much, 6 points to live by, without a doubt, to create a clean and efficient environment. I feel more that your book, though it's very useful for compliance officers around the world, it's also something that probably should start being looked at by business schools as a way to view, because you're not just writing about compliance, Eric, you're writing about how to manage corporations in the world in 2021.
Absolutely. And beyond, because the audience, many of them are Gen Zs. That's who I'd like to target, because they're our future leaders, and they are the ones that care about society and community and all about ESG, which is about long-term stakeholderism as opposed to short-term.
Generation Z cares more for the ethics of the business than the actual amount of money made. They are not as concentrated on getting rich. It's quite different from the 1980s, mindset. And so with that in mind, compliance is really coming into its heyday right now.
I like to think so.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, it's a point where every firm has to talk about it. If you want to gain new investors, it's a conversation that comes up. And whether you're an internet marketing firm or a global financial behemoth like BNP Paribas, compliance is now at the forefront.
Yes, absolutely. I won't say which firm, but I remember I ran into a business person. I had just joined, and the business person growled at me and said, compliance, you run the bank. And I just looked at him and I said, for now. In other words, let's get our act together, and then the business can start running the bank again. And that's what we did.
If a bank has come to a place where compliance is running the bank, it's because they've gone too far askew and they're making decisions that were questionable, and it brought the firm to a place where, quite frankly, the compliance has to step up. And so, compliance, it's not like a necessary evil. Compliance helps a business be a better business. The cleaner a business is, the better a business is. I personally try and make Rebellion as transparent a firm as possible, from our own AI to why we made a trade for you. So the idea of letting anything be opaque, for me, is foreign, especially in 2021. In a post-Madoff, post-financial crisis, post-Corona world, Nobody likes black box. Nobody likes opacity or opaqueness. It's a great word you brought up. And I apologize I can't pronounce it.
No, I was trying to decide, should I say opaqueness or opacity?
9 hearing operations later, I'm not quite perfect, but I do my best. And 15 years of speech therapy. So I unfortunately did not learn to speak English the way everyone else did when they were children. I had to learn on my own. But it's just a great point you bring up, because everything needs sunshine today. Everything must be out there.
Exactly.
And Robinhood, one of the things that made it so successful was being so out there. And then as soon as it had a little bit of opaqueness where they didn't allow people to trade because they couldn't, it wasn't some nefarious thing. If you have $20 billion of trades, you need to put up 1%, that's $200 million. If they don't have $200 million, they can't make those trades anymore. So I don't think there's a nefarious act. I just think they got ahead of themselves. And so
it shows the nanosecond impact of reputational risk as
amazing.
well.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a bit sad.
It is rather sad. Yeah.
And just quickly going back to GE or non-banks versus banks, great at talking about ethics and communicating and training, but when then the Fed came in, because GE became globally systemically important, at least GE Capital, they couldn't prove it through monitoring and surveillance and reporting to the board. And that's, again, where technology—
What do you mean? What couldn't they prove? I apologize.
From an audit trail point of view, that people were actually following the policies or the laws and regs. So they were able to communicate great policies and training and show.
Oh, I see. But the actual execution was just not there.
Right. Whereas the banks are really good, or certainly can be better. They've shown through enforcement actions that they need to be better. They're more advanced with respect to surveillance, whether it be—
Well, Eric, you're getting me worried, because we're entering a world of non-bank financial institutions everywhere, from Apple Pay to Venmo.
Yes.
And, how many of these firms are, potentially going to implode one day and, be a mini LTCM or maybe a big LTCM?
Right. And laws can be changed, but the Fed only has so much reach in terms of who they can bail out or rescue. And we've seen things like that, including LTCM.
Yeah.
But that's where we need the AI. That's where we need predictive analytics across sectors. And that's why my compliance honeycomb leverages off the Homeland Security matrix, because banking, finance, non-banks through technology are all blurring, and it becomes one huge cyber security risk. It becomes a house of cards potentially.
Speaking of house of cards, we just witnessed Germany's largest fintech, Wirecard.
Yes.
That was a complete breakdown of compliance and a complete breakdown of fiduciary management.
And some can argue the government wanted to prop up Wirecard because it was the shiny penny from the local economy.
Indeed.
And so it was across the board, just breakdowns in controls and governance. We've seen that movie way too many times, unfortunately, including in our own country. But then because of everything being interconnected, especially across sectors, with finance being the lifeline of the economy, the risk is even higher.
Do you think that's a major reason why Secretary Paulson did not bail out Lehman, that he felt their compliance was so awful that it was just too black a hole for the government to get behind, whereas he felt Bear Stearns was more of a better run firm? Or do you think that's relevant?
I don't know if it was because of compliance. There were a lot of reasons with respect to Lehman. I don't think compliance was the main reason. I think personality, politics had a lot to do with it as well. And ultimately it was a trade-off. What was in their view the best for the overall global economy at the expense of one. It was that Star Trek saying about the
needs of the few outweigh the needs of the few. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Spock, Star Trek too.
That's right.
Yes, when he dies in the
exactly. Wrath of Khan.
Yes, at the end of Wrath of Khan. Wonderful. Excellent part. Yeah.
But I don't think it was because of compliance. I think there were a lot of other reasons. Now, whether it's the right decision, of course, we know what happens after that.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation, Eric. You're
Thank you.
fantastic. We're getting towards the conclusion of our show. Do you want to give us a few minutes on your book now, Declaration of Independence?
Sure. So it is in two parts. It's
Well,
lessons
when does it get
learned.
released, first of all?
I've been trying to finish it. Originally, I wanted to release it around Election Day, particularly with the name Declaration of Independence. But then the Democrats won, and it really was a game changer in a good way for compliance. So I've been rewriting the beginning and the end. Whistleblowers also I want to underscore, because they are where the rubber meets the road, and I'm trying to focus some chapters on that as well. The second half deals with legislative and other structural changes, including where compliance needs to talk and be with the board without management directly. And management needs to be held more accountable. And I reference the allegory of the cave, if you have a couple more minutes, in that essentially what Plato said is that people in a cave are shackled and they see shadows from a fire lit behind them. And imagine the fire being manipulated with the shadows by the CEO, perhaps the general counsel, and the CFO, meaning those that want the short-term gains. And those that see the shadows are the board and the rest of the employees in compliance. And if you're familiar with the allegory, someone escapes from the cave, ends up outside, sees reality, sees the beauty of the world, wants to go back and tell the rest of those shackled, meaning the board. So it's a matter of enlightening the board as to what reality is, as opposed to just seeing the shadows. And that's what happens in corporations across the world. They just see the shadows and don't want to change.
Oh, wonderful. Of course. When you think about Enron, for instance, I'm actually friends with the former general counsel, and he tells me that he did not, there are things that, he was a little shocked that they did, but he didn't think it was fraud. He thought it was, when they, marked the Blockbuster revenue, he said, okay, maybe it's time to go. But prior to marking Blockbuster revenue that wasn't there, it was very hard to know that they were actually committing fraud. The smoke and the mirrors were so wonderfully put.
Yes, exactly.
Great. Yeah, no, that's a great story you bring up. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Brilliant guy you are, Eric, and so lucky to have had you on today. Really couldn't
Thank you for having
this
me
anymore. And when your book comes out, Rebellion will definitely give a book review of it, and we're excited to read that. And I think business schools across the world would really benefit from considering it. Eric, have a wonderful day and stay safe.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, pleasure was all ours.